Hi everybody, Andronikos here again. I want you to go back in time to 1944. I want you to imagine you're in war-torn Europe. Germany will lose the war in about a year. And you stand up in Britain and say, I've got this great idea. I think we should have a fund to rebuild Europe, including our enemy Nazi Germany, and including Japan, and it should be an interest-free loan or very low interest to help rebuild. What would have been the reaction? One of two things. If I'd have said that in 1944, they would have laughed at me. They would have thought I was crazy. They would have suggested I phone a psychiatrist. Worst case, they'd have thrown me in jail as a traitor, because there were still millions of people who had lost family members to the Nazi Germans, and also in Japan and the Far East. What happened? In 1948, there was something called the Marshall Plan, which was just that. Interest-free or very low-interest loans that included, in certain aspects of that, to rebuild the enemies. And remember, Japan was the only country ever in the history of warfare until now to have had 2 nuclear weapons dropped on them at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So there was this rebuilding exercise, partly to do with the countries that had suffered, the Allies, but also against the enemies. Why have I told you this? I'll save it for a minute. Imagine you were alive in 2000 and I stood up and I said, I've got this great idea. And that is, if we are facing a huge financial problem in Europe, in the European Union, the European Central Bank, which is made up of all the central banks within the European Union, can do something called quantitative easing. So, if our economy is facing a disaster due to a pandemic or our banks are collapsing, the European Central Bank, or even the Federal Reserve of the United States, which is the equivalent of the Central Bank of America, even though it is owned by private banks, can step in and do quantitative easing. What is quantitative easing? It's a very posh way of saying print more money. Let's stop there a second. In 1920s Germany, they had rampant inflation. I know that. As a child, I was a little bit of a geek. I was a bit of a nerd. And I had a stamp collection of all the countries in the world. And I still remember German stamps from the 1920s. If you wanted to send a letter in Germany at that time, the marks, it was in the billions. There's even a story I remember, I'm not sure if it's true, where somebody had a wheelbarrow of cash at around 1928-29, absolutely piled in cash. He popped in to buy something. He came back. The wheelbarrow had been stolen, and they left the worthless cash behind. Now, what does that mean? Well, banks, when they need money, or governments, cannot just print money. There's got to be a system in place. However, what I told you actually happened. Quantitative easing happened in around 2005, also after the banking crisis of 2008. They did print money, but didn't make it wasn't public knowledge, because if you print more money, it becomes less valuable. However, during the coronavirus, both the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve printed electronically, not in a mint. They printed electronically billions upon billions of euros and dollars. In fact, the European Central Bank was printing between 80 and 90 billion euros a month to well over 1 trillion. And what did they do with that money? They didn't just give it away. They lent it to other central banks, to lend to banks, and to lend to reputable corporations so they could keep the economy running. It is a method used to stimulate the economy in a disaster scenario. This brings me to why I've even mentioned this story, and there will be links below that explain what is the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after the Second World War, including Japan, and what is quantitative easing. But here is what I am proposing, and nobody has ever suggested this before, and that is to get the President and government of Turkey and the President and government of Cyprus around the same table to stimulate talks for a settlement. And we'll include the leadership of the North, Northern Cyprus, I am suggesting, in parallel to any political settlement, that what I will do if I'm elected as a Euro MP is I will lay seeds. I will lay seeds to have a combination of quantitative easing from the European Central Bank and a Marshall Plan to raise an enormous amount of money to get a settlement, to get any type of settlement. We need political solutions, but we also need money. And what I am recommending, and I've used a figure of 100 billion, which in the overall economy of the European Union is tiny, is that the European Central Bank, I'm not suggesting they provide all the funding, they provide most of the funding, which won't cost them anything because it's electronic money. I am proposing they lend it to Turkey, for Turkey to give it to us. I'm not discussing the percentages. I'm saying it should be zero or very low interest, and that money can be used to get a settlement for the Cyprus problem, because I am sick and tired of hearing the word Cyprus problem. It has been 50 years since the 1974 invasion. It is 20 years since Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots voted on the Annan Plan. Let's move forward. I will lay seeds. I am not saying if I am elected, I will turn up in Zurich at the European Central Bank, knock on a few doors, and then come back with a few suitcases of 100 billion in cash. I'm not stupid. I'm not saying it. I will lay seeds. Now, why have I said 100 billion? This is where we've got to look into the potential solutions. In my presidential manifesto, which was February 2023, I gave a blueprint how, if I was elected, I would resolve the Cyprus problem. It's on my website, andronikos.cy. I have the full manifesto there. It's section 32. It runs to several pages. I believe it's 12 pages in English and around 9 pages in Greek. Well, it's the other way around, actually. And I gave my blueprint, which is, if the Turks want a legal divorce, if we decide we do not want to be a united, one happy country, I am saying I was willing to talk about it. Now, I am not treading on the government's toes. I fully accept Mr. Christodoulidis and his government are doing their best to get the Turks round the table. I'm not going to interfere with that. I will not interfere with that until December 2026. Then I will. But until then, I've laid seeds where a settlement can happen. Now, if Turkey, on behalf of the north of Cyprus, want a divorce, I am suggesting that on certain conditions, which is, we want some of their water. They've built a pipe between southern Turkey and northern Cyprus. It carries water to our island. Let's build a second. They want our electricity, and they want part of the natural gas that is in the southern waters of Cyprus. I'm suggesting they can have 18.6% of it, because that was the population of the Turkish Cypriots in Greece at around the time of in Cyprus, at around 1960. That could be used to pay for a potential divorce. Because after 50 years, and here is the history, in 1960, we as a nation were born. Through an arranged marriage, we Greek Cypriots married Turkish Cypriots. We were one country. Within 2 or 3 years, we didn't share the same bedroom. There was no more romance, if that's the right word. We had separate bedrooms. In 1974, disaster struck. Our extended families got involved. It caused an invasion. I am suggesting, and I am putting it to people who are listening to this, my solution, which is anything from the small version, we don't get 100 billion, we get a few billion. The Turkish Cypriots hand back Varosi or Varosha, the fenced-off city, the area around it. Let's rebuild that city. Let's lock it down to the ground and rebuild it. It's full of asbestos. There's planes that go back to about 1974 still there. Let's knock it down, build it again, and create this beautiful garden city that we as Cypriots will be proud of. The other extreme, which involves politicians, such as our two governments, with the involvement of the northern authorities, is if they want a divorce. And I am saying, which goes back to the very first thing I was saying, with quantitative easing and with the European Central Bank, which is basically 36 people who run it. There's 27 member states with each of their national central banks within the EU, plus 6 people that sit on the council. 33 people can help us fund a settlement that politicians could decide how much is payable by Greek Cypriots or Turkish Cypriots, and that loan, similar to the Marshall Plan and similar ones, doesn't have to be repaid for 50 years. No capital needs to be repaid. It is free money to be used for a cause, which is, let's not be the only country in the EU that has a divided capital and divided country. It will be good for peace. It'll be good for Cyprus. It'll be good for EU. And we can lead the way to make this happen. So, quantitative easing, 1. 2, a type of Marshall Plan. Let's get economists, Nobel Prize winners, with brains the size of planets, to come up with an even better idea. But I am saying I will lay seeds. I have no authority if I'm elected an MEP to get involved, but I will lay seeds so that the Turkish Cypriots, the Turks, and the Greek Cypriots can start seriously talking about a solution after 50 years to the Cyprus problem, because I am sick and tired of the amount of energy that goes in to try to resolve it. I have the solution, and thank you for listening to me.